go.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this last session of the FEANTSA Forum. My name is Michele Calandrino, and I am team leader for homelessness at the European Commission in the Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. So we got in a sense, the worst slot of the day, and I guess we're all a bit low in energy, but luckily we have two excellent speakers presenting two very good papers. We have Professor Eoin O'Sullivan from Trinity College, Dublin, and Professor Peter Mackie from Cardiff University. So before I give the floor to our two colleagues here, I would like to give a bit of a background to the two papers that you will hear about today. As you saw in the presentation of the workshop, these papers were presented for two mutual learning events that we organized in the context of the European Platform on Combatting Homelessness. This morning you heard from both Stephen Olson and Yves Leterme, the organization, and a few explanations about the platform that was founded and launched 2 years ago in June 2021. As you heard again this morning, the work program of the platform is divided into three work strands. The first one being on mutual learning. So the purpose of mutual learning event was to support member states to design and improve national homelessness strategy. So the first mutual learning event that we organized was the one on the overview and of strategies, the key element that should be included, and that is the paper that Eoin will present today. The framework for homelessness strategy that he sort of designed, also using material research he had done together with other colleagues, is sort of divided into different stages. So we first, which are logical stage, not necessarily temporal stages. So the first element is prevention, so which is the most cost-effective and most effective policy anyway. So prevent people to become homeless in the first place. Secondly, there's all the policies related to the supports of people that are already in a situation of homelessness. And then we have policies that would help to exit from homelessness. And then finally, there is, of course, the more analytical framework of monitoring and evaluating policies. So as I said, Eoin, Professor O'Sullivan did the first paper, and Peter Mackie prepared the second paper for the second mutual learning on prevention policies. That mutual learning took place at a period where the cost of living crisis was at the max. The prices were, for the energy prices and utility, were growing and growing, and sort of reached a peak at that stage. So at that point, the issue of prevention in terms of avoiding eviction, supporting people for the forthcoming winter was one of our top priority. The cost of living crisis is still there. Energy prices have gone down, but the impact and of inflation is still affecting many people. So we look forward also to see a sort of updated vision on prevention policies. The third mutual learning that we did, as I said, followed the third logical step in homelessness strategy, and it was about services, both health services and social services, so how to support and help people that were already in a situation of homelessness. And On Wednesday and Thursday, we had the fourth mutual learning organized by the platform that focused on specific group, in particular migrant and EU mobile citizens. The Lisbon Declaration, which launched the European platform, states that we want to promote integrated, person-centered, housing-led approaches to homelessness, and hence the need to look at the specific group. So the first, which was in our case the third, so the mutual learning that we had on services looked at how to help in a sort of horizontal way all different groups. And then yesterday and Wednesday we focused more specifically on these two groups. We still have two mutual learning events to go. So following the roadmap that Eoin set for us, one will be on exiting housing-led and all other policies to support people to sustainably exit from homelessness. And the other mutual learning will be, although the topic have not been set in stone yet, will be on data monitoring and evaluation. So this is for the first pillar, which is on mutual learning. And just to inform you, in case you haven't seen it, this first cycle of sort of more bird view of homelessness strategies will finish in the beginning of 24 with the Belgian presidency. And we have now launched an action grant for a project and actions to support the platform through capacity and knowledge building, including through mutual learning. So the deadline will be next week on the 6th of June. And the idea is that the consortium that will carry out this grant will follow on the activity of the mutual learning, but possibly with a more bottom-up approach, so bringing together also the experience that we have today in this room, because this call was reserved for NGO, civil society organization with whom the Commission has a partnership agreement. The second pillar of the platform is on data. And again, in today and in the previous days, this is something which has come up over and over again. We cannot have effective policies if we don't know the extent of the problem and how to measure it. And to this purpose, we are supporting a project by the OECD that will sort of map the data available, monitoring strategies, and will eventually also design a policy toolkit. And also we have launched a call for tender for a project on a pilot project on a European homeless count that was initiated by the European Parliament. The deadline for that call has expired, and we are now in the process of evaluating the proposal that we received, and we aim at launching this pilot project at the end of the year that will focus on a number of cities. So first, it'll be 2 rounds. In the first year, it will focus on a more restricted number of cities. It will experiment on the methodology. And then in the second stage, the idea is to increase this count. Now, the interest of this project is twofold. One is sort of methodological. We have heard that in many cities, in many member states, there are already, of course, a lot of homelessness counts. The idea here is to see what sort of methodology can be applied, what common denominator can be used, what methodological approach could work in all member states, and of course, and in the cities. And the first step is, of course, by looking at what is already available there. So the OECD work will feed into this. And also, we hope on the Commission side that we can have a more kind of detailed look at the migration issue within the homeless population. This is something, as I said, that we looked into the recent mutual learning. And what we heard from member states, of course, is that the number of migrants and refugees is substantial and is increasing within the homeless population, and especially in a number of member states, the Ukrainian refugees constitute a large number and is expected in certain member states to increase quite substantially since the last count that they did. So I will be very clear. Of course, migrants can be homeless, so we can have homeless migrants, we can have homeless refugees. So the idea is not to exclude. What we have put in the call is a request to see how these groups can be identified, because there is no point in searching for the holy grail of the headline number of how many homeless people are if we don't know what is behind this number. So clearly, these different populations, including refugees, migrants, the EU nationals and so on and so forth, there are different drivers. Clearly, to go back to the example of Ukraine, is the case of the war. So they have different drivers, they have different policy. Refugees are responsibility of different ministries, and we see member states, certain member states have a target to reduce or eliminate homelessness, and there are certain departments, like Department of Housing, that are responsible to achieve this target, but they don't have the policy levers because, as I said, there is a huge number of people in a situation of asylum seeking or refugees, and of course, housing departments don't have the competency and responsibility for this type of policy. And then, last but not least, there is the third strand is on access to finance. And you already heard this morning that the European Commission is chairing with the Council of Euro Development Bank a work group within the platform to look at what funding is available at European level, national level, what funding instrument can be proposed, how loan can be combined with grants, so looking at all the issue of blending. So at the beginning, this group is quite small, operational. We have a number of cities. In fact, we have more cities than member states because the local level is the one that has biggest responsibility in delivering project for the homeless people. But the idea of the group is to open it up to all the expertise and knowledge where relevant in the course of the work. So this is also an invitation to all of you through FEANTSA to contribute where relevant to the work on finance. And then just to finish, because it's also related to the issue of research, the Commission will launch a social innovation call at the end of the year. That will be the biggest call that we have had on homelessness. Is a multi-million project, and as you probably have seen or can see, in the work program of the ESF Plus that is going to fund the easy strand of the ESF Plus, which is going to fund this project. One of the focus that we want to put is to promote and piloting social innovation, but in a sense of true social experimentation. So the idea of piloting new projects, new initiatives, but accompanied by a thorough evaluation. So I'm saying this one because we always hear from the research community that what is lacking at European level is a proper evaluation of what works and what doesn't work, and we always have to refer to the more Anglo-Saxon, North American, even Australian research community to have proper and sound evaluation. Well, now the ball is in your field, and we will see what we can have in terms of also good evaluation when it comes to social innovation. Now, without any further ado, I'll give the floor to Professor O'Sullivan for the first presentation. Eoin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michele. Okay, so what I've been asked to present on is kind of a summary and an update of this paper, which is available on the EPOC website, which, as Michele said, kicked off the mutual learning exercise last June in Brussels. And the objective is to provide a kind of a conceptual framework of the dynamics of homelessness, drawing on key lessons from research and how these lessons can inform through mutual learning collaboration the configuration of practices and policies in member states while reflecting their diversity in devising integrated strategies to end homelessness. And it was really about looking at where we can prevent homelessness from occurring for those that enter homelessness to minimize their duration by ensuring rapid exits to secure accommodation. So in brief, the conceptual model looks something like this, was drawn very much building on the work of Pete and Suzanne Fitzpatrick and colleagues, and was trying to think of homelessness as a dynamic process that people go through and exit at different points. So in the first part, we want to try to prevent homelessness, and there are different stages of prevention, universal, upstream, crisis, emergency. And as you go along, the populations get smaller because hopefully you're stopping a lot of people at different stages. When we get then to emergency prevention, and we conceptualize in that way that quite often we think of shelters in a different way. In this way, we're thinking about shelters as preventing something, as preventing rough sleeping. And we'll come later to the significant limitations of shelters, but one important role they do play is to minimize the number of people who do need to rough sleep. And then when we look at entries to homelessness, how do we reduce dependency in shelters? How do we minimize duration in homeless accommodation? And how do we exit people to secure tenancies? And then finally, at the end, repeat prevention, so that how do we ensure that people who do exit homelessness don't come back into the system again? So that was broadly kind of the flow model, trying to think through the different stages of a homeless person. Like, what are the different stages that you can prevent them coming into emergency accommodation? When they do enter, how do we reduce that dependency on shelters, minimize that duration, and ensure rapid exits to secure tenancies? And then on top of all this, what kind of governance structure do we need to have in place to manage that system? We've become increasingly aware of the systemic nature of our responses, that it has to be an integrated response. So what governance structures need to be in place? And then at the bottom, how we evaluate, as Michele was saying, all those different stages to ensure that we know what's working best for what different populations. So that was the broad way we conceptualized how we would respond to homelessness in terms of devising strategies. This simply gives us a broad indication of trends. We avoided at any cost putting numbers in this, partly because, as you're all aware, every country has a different definition. They count homelessness in different ways. But if we take them on their own terms, we just treat it as an index. It tells us whether homelessness is increasing or decreasing by that country's terms over that period, roughly from, we took 2008 to 2022, where we do have reasonably good time series data. I move to the next slide very quickly because that top line, unfortunately, kind of distorts it. That top line, regrettably, is my own country, Ireland. Sorry. Get my makeup done properly. So when we exclude Ireland, it makes it a bit easier to see. So we do see, as the point was made by Ruth Owen this morning, there are a number of examples. So when we get pessimistic, is it possible to end homelessness by 2030, as set out in the Lisbon Declaration? We have to say, well, it is, because we do have a number of examples. In this case, we see it's Norway and Finland, and then the yellow line in Denmark, which has seen a reduction in recent years. So there are examples across the member states where, over a longish period of time, there have been reductions achieved in homelessness. Same with the Netherlands up the top, but it had been increasing rapidly. But in the other countries where we do have a decent time series, regrettably, the trend is upwards. But there are enough examples there to say, well, what are those countries doing that they can reduce their numbers? So it's not an entirely pessimistic picture. And one of the issues relating to that data was, well, it's all point-in-time data, so it tells us a little bit about the demographics and disabilities of those experiencing homelessness. It really doesn't tell us anything about the dynamics of homelessness. And the profile of those who experience homelessness over time is very different from the profile of people at a point in time. I said you're capturing those with more complex needs when you look at homelessness at a point in time. And regrettably, most countries it is point-in-time data. Most media coverage of homelessness fixed on covers or reports on surveys that look at homelessness at a point in time and gives us a very distorted picture of homelessness. So that we argue that the dynamics of homelessness, we need to understand that if we are to have intelligent policy design. And in the intervening period from when I drafted that to today, as Michele pointed out, there has been a call that is closed for a European Homelessness Council. This is an extraordinary shift forward in the sense that we will now have the basis of a kind of a comparative account of homelessness across the European Union using a common definition and a common methodology. And that will play out over 2024 and 2025. So certainly by 2026, we'll have a much better idea. And it was a fairly obvious first step because when we looked at the initial Lisbon Declaration of ending homelessness by 2030, the first question was, well, how will we know if we've achieved it when we don't have any accurate data in the majority of member states? And in the majority of countries that do have data, it's not very accurate anyway. So this is a really important development. And I suppose a lot of what framed our discussions of that conceptual framework was the lessons we'd learned, I suppose, in the last decade or so from increasingly sophisticated social science research. And we were specific about social science research. Probably the biggest bulk of research in homelessness comes to the medical community. And for those who are interested, there's quite a detailed paper in a recent edition of the European Journal of Homelessness, which talks about the distorting effect of that medical research. It gives us a completely distorted understanding of homelessness, mainly because of inadequate methodologies in terms of using cross-sectional designs, convenient sampling. Every rudimentary mistake a social scientist would say, you can't do it that way. The medics do it all the time. So we get a very distorted picture of homelessness from medical research. So this is very much based on the state of the art of social science research. So we talk about homelessness as a dynamic process and the outcome of the interaction between macro and micro circumstances. And some of the key lessons we've learned in the last decade, and we picked the last decade because back in 2010, under the Belgian presidency, the Commission had funded a consensus conference on homelessness in Europe, and we produced a review of the state of the knowledge of homelessness at that time in 2010. So it was really updating what we knew in the last decade. And some of the key things we thought emerged of that decade was firstly that those who experience homelessness are not randomly distributed across the population. So this idea we're all 2 paychecks away from homelessness or there for the grace of God go I, it's not true. But those who experience homelessness are part of a larger population of disadvantaged households for whom housing insecurity is pervasive and a semi-permanent feature of their lives. So kind of one of these myths that we're all 2 paychecks away, we're not all at risk of homelessness. The size of that disadvantaged population is driven by the extent of poverty and social exclusion, housing affordability, and the degree to which labour markets are constrained. So, in other words, the larger the population of disadvantaged households, the greater the number of people or households who will experience homelessness over time. And we'll come back to the dynamics of that. And the other thing that became really clear from the really important results from the Journeys Home study in Australia, which is probably the most methodologically robust set of data we have on homelessness, was all of their data consistently highlighted the low predictive power of personal characteristics in explaining homeless entries. And again, a constant myth is, well, those who enter homelessness because of a range of disabilities and dysfunctions and various other things like that. It's not a good predictor of those who will enter homelessness. Personal characteristics are not a good predictor. Equally, we know not all disadvantaged households will experience homelessness, and we're still a bit unclear why that may be the case. It may be determined by the stock of social or financial or emotional resources to to disadvantaged individuals and households who find themselves in objectively similar structural circumstances but may have stocks of various forms of capital that provide a buffer against them entering homelessness. It's equally quite difficult to predict the households from that larger group who will enter homelessness. But we do know, for example, that single-parent households are less likely than joint-parent households to have the financial capital to buffer them against unexpected events. So they are more likely. And it's because of that reason. It's not because they're lone parents. It's because they simply don't have the financial capital to provide that buffer. And also, to be clear, individual level risky behaviours such as excessive or persistent use of psychopharmacological substances also increases the risk of homelessness. And I think Dan O'Flaherty, an American economist, some of his formulations I think have become increasingly important, and his argument is that those who experience homelessness are those who experience a conjunction of adverse structural and personal circumstances. That is, in other words, he said, it's been the wrong person in the wrong place. If you're the wrong person with certain personal difficulties, then in the wrong place where there's a tight labour market or lack of access to housing, then that's what will trigger your episode of homelessness. As I said, for those who do enter emergency accommodation or do experience homelessness, it's a process of entering various forms of residential instability, such as using emergency accommodation or staying with family and friends. The duration does vary, but for the majority, and it's really important to understand that the majority of people who enter homelessness, their experience is once-off and brief. Probably a good example is my own country, Ireland, where in the last 9 years, the number of people experiencing homelessness at a point in time has increased. So it's about 8,000 adults or so at the moment. But over the last 9 years, 50,000 unique adults entered our emergency accommodation service. So clearly the vast majority of people who entered had a short, brief, and probably relatively unpleasant stay in emergency accommodation, but exited again and never returned. So the majority of households experiencing homeless will exit, but some will experience a cycle of repeated, often short spells, and for others, an experience of prolonged homelessness. And all of the evidence really over the last decade or so, and it was there probably more implicit rather than explicitly previous to that, the single and most important public policy response is simply the adequate supply of affordable and secure housing. There is no other way. You can play around with every other thing, but in the absence of that, of the absence of secure, an adequate supply of affordable and secure housing, you will never end homelessness. And the provision of that supply can substantially reduce the number of households who will experience homelessness in the first instance, and for those who do, to ensure a rapid exit. Again, this is a quote from Dan O'Flaherty. I suppose there was a decade ago a contention that for those with complex needs, most people were too sick to be housed. He said, look, the evidence at this stage, and Eric and colleagues there, and Tim Aubrey, their research from the Shea Swa study kind of demonstrate emphatically people with complex needs can be housed and they can remain housed. So that idea that most homeless people were too sick to be housed is no longer a credible proposition. In terms of prevention, I'll run through that very quickly because that's going to be the topic of Pete's talk. But there is evidence that there are a range of interventions that have the potential to significantly reduce the flow into homelessness. But again, all effective interventions require a sufficient level of secure and affordable housing. Otherwise, it becomes a form of gatekeeping. And that is a danger. Without that adequate supply, you're simply rationing a limited supply of housing for those who require it. In terms of entry to homeless services, for the majority of people, it's either sofa surfing or doubling up or into emergency accommodation. And Pete has done an extensive piece of work on this. But I said, despite endless and extensive critiques of emergency or congregate emergency accommodation as a response to the residential stability that people experience, and there's very little positive work that comes from any evaluation of those interventions, it is still probably the most significant intervention in the lives of the majority of people experiencing homelessness in the majority of member states. It's also extraordinarily expensive, and for a minority of shelter users, they also make extensive use of other expensive emergency health and criminal justice services as they traverse through what Kim Hopper called the institutional circuit of short stays in various services without ever resolving their residential instability. But for the majority of people, their experience in shelters is generally an unpleasant stay in unpleasant circumstances. But unfortunately, for a number of member states, it will remain the case that emergency accommodation will be a standard response to homelessness in the short to medium term. But I said it can also be conceptualized as a form of emergency prevention in that it ensures the majority of those who lose access to housing don't at least find themselves unsheltered. What else has become clear is that that in all member states, there are a range of individual and collective acts of kindness and compassion towards those experiencing homelessness. They're largely well-intentioned, but I think we're very clear at this stage they are also largely hopelessly ineffective, and in fact, in some cases, can be counterproductive. And that purposeful, assertive street outreach with the provision of suitable accommodation is an effective means of meeting the needs of entrenched rough sleepers. Soup and sandwiches and various forms of suits and wheelie bins and various other things conjured up by entrepreneurs will not end homelessness. It is purposeful assertive street outreach with housing will work. All the other things will not. In terms of duration, Dennis Culhane and his colleagues had kind of established this pattern that has now been replicated in a number of other countries, that the duration of homelessness is typically either long-term, episodic or transitory. But crucially, about 80% of shelter users are transitional users in that they use shelters for a very short period of time or a single episode and did not return. And the remaining 20% are divided between episodic and long-term users. And again, the issue here is that when we look at our point-in-time data, when countries use that measure, you're capturing that 20% by and large. You're not capturing the 80% who are coming in or come into emergency accommodation and exit again quickly. So you get a very distorted picture of homelessness when you use point-in-time data. More dynamic data gives a very, very different picture of who those who are experiencing homelessness are. For those who get stuck in emergency accommodation, explanations also often focus on the individual characteristics of those in emergency accommodation, or that the longer spells of homelessness simply reduce the likelihood of exiting, or it's simply bad luck why you get stuck. But to date, researchers haven't really been able to disentangle those explanations empirically. But again, based on the Journeys Home data from Australia, the individual risk factors commonly associated with entering homelessness, they argue, are completely unrelated to the length of time people are likely to remain without adequate housing. In terms of exits, we conceptualize them in three different ways: secure, quasi-secure exits and insecure exits. The first one, secure exits, that is those exiting to social housing tenancies provided either by not-for-profit bodies or municipal authorities. And those who exit to that form of tenancy are unlikely to return, mainly due to the high level of secure occupancy, that is, security of tenure, fixed rents, etc. So those who exit to that form of a tenancy are unlikely to return to emergency accommodation. Quasi-secure exits are to tenancies provided in the private rental sector, where security of tenure, depending on the country you're in, is weak to moderate. So there's a kind of moderate likelihood of you returning to emergency accommodation if you exit to that form of a tenancy. And finally, insecure tenancies, that is returning to families, staying with friends or families, or moving to other institutions. So they're positive in one sense that they exit, but there's a very strong likelihood that those who exit to insecure exits will simply end up back in emergency accommodation again. I think what we've also learned is that while some households will require supports to maintain their tenancy, for the majority, no additional supports other than financial ones are necessary. They don't need caseworkers, they don't need care workers, they don't need anything other than the financial support to maintain their tenancies. The small number do, but the majority do not. And for those with the complex needs, Housing First has demonstrated a high level of housing retention, and we're all fairly familiar with the work of, as I said, of Tim and his colleagues in Canada. And again, the research demonstrates that that concur that whatever interaction of personal and structural factors that lead to their entry into homelessness, by and large, do not predict their likelihood of exiting homelessness. And they argue for the relative importance of tenure and support over personal circumstances. In terms of governance, the top line in that conceptual model, it's not surprising we argue that given the recent area of research is focused on changing the homeless system rather than changing people. That seems to be the important lesson that we've learned. It's about changing the system of governance of homelessness rather than changing people's behaviours. And this is driven by an evidence-based understanding that homelessness is a solvable issue rather than an unresolvable, wicked social problem. And that crucial to ending homelessness, designing integrated models of service provision, especially housing and funding. And the objective effect of homeless systems should be to prevent entries to homelessness in the first instance. And for those who do experience homelessness, the objective is to minimize the duration of that experience by rapidly exiting households to secure affordable accommodation with support if required, thus reducing the likelihood of a further experience of homelessness and allowing for the reduction of costly emergency accommodation and the alleviation of the individual trauma associated with a spell of homelessness. And there would appear to be across the European Union a consensus that integrated strategic approaches are effective at successfully preventing homelessness and responding to it rapidly when it does occur. The formulation of national or local strategies should involve all stakeholders and ensure that all stakeholders buy in. And from work doing with Tim and colleagues across North America and a number of countries in Europe, given a negotiated process of consensus building among stakeholders, in particular those with lived experience, is crucial to developing and sustaining what can often be a difficult and complex journeys of systems transformation. And further key issues seem to us to be governance issues must be stable and consistent. That really came across from the Finnish experience. The strategies need to be sustained as well as comprehensive and integrated. That housing-led and housing-first services are less effective outside an integrated strategy. And the importance of leadership, stability and continuity within relevant homeless governance structures are important for evidence-based policy. So that's a very quick run through the paper. Those of you who are particularly interested can look at the detail of it, but I hope to take any questions after Pete gives his talk, so thank you very much.
So I think it would be best to have the debate afterwards because the two papers are, somehow linked. But before we pass the floor to Pete, are there like a couple of very quick factual clarification that you want to ask for the paper, or we leave it? Yes, one question here.
Stakeholder buy-in. Around the table in some countries, the stakeholders are the private rented sector, and I was really interested by your identification of the issues in terms of tenure, really, and the likelihood of repeat homelessness. So I was just interested in your view on that.
Yeah, I think so. I think there are plenty of examples where there has been positive engagement with the private sector with either individual landlords or clusters or associations of landlords. While, as I said, they are really an insecure exit, but nonetheless, for some people, it'll be in the short to medium term, we will need the private rental sector to provide those tendencies. So yes, I think they're an important stakeholder in the overall formulation of a policy to end homelessness.
Okay, so I don't see any more hands, and before I give the floor to Pete, just I want to abuse my position just to make a couple of comments myself. So the point that Eoin did on the dynamic and flow is taken, is absolutely important. There are, of course, a lot of challenges, and when it comes to European level, one of the biggest challenges, of course, the issue of having some sort of consistent and common definition. So this is, for us, the starting point, which will be already a very big challenge. But we hope that maybe with the other projects that we will launch, maybe this is a sort of analysis that we can have a member state level where there is a more homogeneous institutional framework, definitions, and so on and so forth. Just to also say that next year, so there is field work now. Next year we will have the results of the module on housing deprivation by the EU SILC, which is a survey on income and living conditions. And what the survey does is to look at past experiences of homelessness. Now, we can have a whole day of debates on the limitations, the pros and cons of this type of data, but it will be yet another piece into this puzzle, and it will help to highlight certain things that Eoin mentioned in terms of this idea of flow and people coming out from from homelessness. And to finish my brief intermezzo, one word on the issue of handy homelessness, because we often talk about it, and often it is seen as sort of wishful thinking by politicians. We say, well, homelessness is going up and so on and so forth. So I would like to invite you all to refer to the Lisbon Declaration. You do an internet search, Lisbon Declaration, homelessness, and you will see that actually the objective of ending homelessness is quite well defined, is not perfect, is not super operational, but at European level we really like to take into account different dimensions, including those that Eoin said. So we say that we want to reduce to zero rough sleeping, and that is true, because it's the most extreme form of homelessness, for sort of voluntary, in a sense, rough sleeping. Policymakers have acknowledged that they cannot in a sense, solve every problem. That there are certain things, certain personal factors that happen that are outside the control. Then the second element of the target is about duration. So we do look, and the idea is to keep the duration of homelessness as short as possible. Then there is the issue of deinstitutionalization. So everybody leaving prison, hospital, or care, they should have an offer of accommodation. There is the issue of eviction, and this links with the presentation by Pete. So the idea of the eviction should be prevented, and when it happens, people should be offered alternative accommodation, and then discrimination. So, this to show that indeed we need data, but we also need to have some more also qualitative thinking and analysis of the situation. Sorry for robbing a couple of minutes, and the floor is yours.
Great. Everybody wanted to stay longer anyway. I'm not cutting anything. Right. Prydawn da, good afternoon, and diolch yn fawr, thank you very much. It's 5:45, you're still here. Half of you are either my Welsh family or my Canadian, North American, Irish family. The other half, particularly well done for sticking around. So here we go, we're going to go on a little whirlwind tour of homelessness prevention and hopefully keep you awake, though they are blinding us with these lights to probably stop us seeing Steve Gates falling asleep at the back. So here we go. And apologies to have to turn a little bit to see the slides. But the aim of the presentation and the task given to me for the mutual learning platform was to take a look across prevention and to, rather than talk about the big strategic cross-cutting goals, to kind of look at more concrete examples of prevention where prevention has worked, to put out a few concrete examples. But there are a few caveats to make in a presentation about what works in homelessness prevention. First one, we're really bad at defining homelessness prevention. I could go around all of you that haven't been to one of my presentations before and we'd get a different definition. That's one thing. We're also really bad, as Michele says, at evaluation, and I mean robust, rigorous evaluation of even our mainstream kind of crisis interventions, let alone our prevention interventions where you're trying to measure something that didn't happen. And then the second critique is, look, this was a fairly quick exercise, lit review and my own knowledge. There are other more robust pieces of work out there, but I'll give you a decent overview. This is also not, I'm not going into the detail of every country and telling you which country is doing something well. If you're interested in kind of the nitty-gritty of which countries are doing different things, Isabel Baptista and colleagues have done an awesome piece of work that is worth having a look at. So that gives you a kind of country-by-country allocation of some of these things. So what am I going to do? I'll give you the definition that you've been waiting for, and then talk about two main parts of our definition. I'll talk about upstream intervention, and I'll talk about crisis prevention. Then I'm going to give you just one slide on prevention during crises, and this was just something I was asked to include. It's not something you really see much in the literature, so it's mostly just some reflections. And at the end, we'll just reflect across some of the evidence and what it tells us about the enablers and the barriers, the things that enable us to do good prevention, and actually the things that stop us doing it too. So that's what we're going to do. Right. So here's the common message. You can read it from people with lived experience of homelessness. Any interview I've ever done, where I often use what we call the housing pathways approach, you talk about a journey. Any interview I've ever done, the message that has come back is, you could have intervened here, you could have intervened here, here, and here. And by the way, I was probably homeless 3 times before I asked anyone for help. Right? So there are so many opportunities missed in every journey we hear. In Isabel Baptista's report, where they did a review of country by country, here's just a little bit of context. 5 countries reported a lack of any prevention services. It was 2019, so things have moved a little bit, but not much. 15 countries, very limited provision. 5 reported preventative measures, which can't be considered as extensive, and then 9 which said they had comprehensive systems. That's not a great state of affairs across Europe. And I actually think if you applied our typology to those countries, it would look even worse. Okay, so let's get on with the story. So the very starting point, I'm going to talk you through a typology that we didn't develop, we've advanced it and used it. It came from local authorities and people in practice. Suzanne Fitzpatrick, Jenny Wood and I have worked with it. The first point in our temporal typology, time-based typology, is universal prevention. That's the stuff we do population-wide. It's the things that really matter and that we've heard so much about already. We need primarily housing that is affordable and is in places where people want to live. Those that have heard me give this talk before know how important that caveat is, because too often we've got, in some places, some member states, you've got affordable housing, but nobody wants to live there. Right? So it has to be in places where people want to live. And the other one is that people have an income, so poverty reduction. The evidence tells us you do those 2 things and you bring homelessness right down. So that's our universal prevention. I'm not going to talk any more about that today. It's been said enough. But it's the foundation, the keystone of prevention efforts. Then we get onto the typology and we get onto part 2, upstream prevention. We have loads of data and evidence that tells us there are particular population groups who are at greater risk of becoming homeless. And we know that often that relates to transitions from some of our failing institutions. Yeah, our prisons, our care system, our asylum system, all of these different systems that we know people become homeless from, that's upstream prevention. The populations we know at risk and we can intervene. Then we get to what we call crisis prevention. This is where homelessness is foreseeable in the future. Or homelessness is likely to occur in the foreseeable future. Now, in the UK context, when we use this, we've traditionally used 56 days. We love days and not months in the UK because we use the law, so you have to be more precise. And we use that because an eviction notice gives you 2 months to get out. So, but in your state, in your country, it will be whatever. If your eviction notice, then homelessness is foreseeable. That's what we're talking about here. We've got enough time to do some pretty good stuff around prevention if we find out at that point. Then we get to what we call emergency prevention. Emergency prevention is if I do not do something today, this person is going to be homeless tomorrow. Now, of course, you should be getting the sense that we want to be moving further upstream in this typology, because if we only have today to find the solution, there aren't many good solutions available to us. We don't have time to mediate with a landlord, with parents and family. This is, our options are really limited. And then at the very end, the one that's kind of a bit of an outlier, we've got repeat prevention, or tertiary prevention in the public health model. This is stopping it happening again, but homelessness has already occurred. Most of the presentations I have been to in this session and in most conferences I go to talk about emergency and repeat prevention. Hands up who's heard of Housing First? This was a rhetorical question. Your hands should all be up, right? Everyone's heard of Housing First. That's where we've been told this is our paradigm. This is the shift. We should all be going for Housing First. That's under kind of emergency and repeat prevention. I'm not even going to touch it because we need to be further upstream. Yeah, that's the shift that we need, is to be far, far earlier. That's not to belittle the value and the impacts of Housing First. We need that emergency, but we've got to shift our eyes up. So I'm going to talk through a few of these. So upstream prevention, and I'll talk a little bit about institutional settings. Drawing on a systematic review by Jennifer Hanratty, they looked at a whole load of different discharge programs. They looked at the outcomes, did a meta-analysis of the outcomes. And look, they found that some of these interventions have pretty positive impacts on housing stability, but evidence base was a little bit limited and a little bit sparse. And the crucial thing is that the characteristic of these interventions in institutions is timing and duration. So timing, do we intervene in the prison, for instance, before somebody's going to be released, work with these individuals, and then provide support ongoing into the community? And then how long do we stay with that person providing support? And that's what you see, huge variation in the kind of the nature of the interventions. Critical time interventions are the best evidenced form of intervention in these institutional settings. There's the most evidence there. That doesn't mean it's the best, it just means there's the most evidence on it. And it says, look, it works. Critical time interventions involve an intervention in prison, for instance, and then it's phased out over 9 months of phasing out of support. 3 months, really intensive support. 3 months, we phase out, it's handing over to the community, and in the last 3 months, very light touch over fully to community supports. Critical time interventions, though, we're trying to pilot one in England and Wales, or Crisis are doing the pilot, we're doing the evaluation. And would you believe it? The prisons are facing exact same problems that we are in homelessness services. They are totally overstretched and they are working at crisis point. So despite the fact that you're trying to get a worker in there to do all the planning for discharge so that somebody does not go into even emergency accommodation, you just cannot get the staff to engage and work with you because they are so busy dealing with crises in prisons with huge caseloads, exactly as our frontline staff are. So we can have these great models, these great interventions, but if we're not staffing within these institutions where we're trying to stop homelessness occurring, then we've got this massive barrier. We're not going to succeed. And of course, there are examples where we're doing far more effective things. Finland always comes up. I'm not going to give Finland any more kudos today. You can go and read about it. Right. Then we go, carrying on in institutional settings to talk about aging out of care. Now, this is one where those of you who have seen me speak will know this is coming, but I find it really important to do. I went to a session yesterday on youth homelessness, and we were talking about care leavers. Hands up if you've heard of the term care leavers. Do answer this one, care leavers. Yeah, is that a common term where everyone is? Yeah, care leavers. We had this poet who came to give a talk in Wales called Lem Cisse, brilliant, has been through the care system, and he says to us, you've got to stop that. Stop calling people care leavers. They don't leave care. Care leaves them. And it's so important. It's so important because that's what we do. Care just stops. Care leaves them. And we talk about care leavers. So this is aging out of care. I aged and care left me. Again, it's a major main route into homelessness, and it's an area that we know we can do work to prevent it. Again, looking at a systematic review, findings incredibly mixed from the evidence base, and they even find that with interventions, some of these interventions that are looking to make planned transitions from care into housing, it's still normal to become homeless in some of those contexts, even with the intervention in. Like normal, more than 50% will become homeless. So It's an area where we're failing miserably. We have Housing First for Youth. We have approaches that we know can work. There's a really good emerging evidence base around Housing First for Youth, particularly in the Canadian context. There are pilots in Europe, but we're still failing in a major way with this population group. I gave this presentation in the US, and somebody came to see me after and says, well, actually, you don't talk about chosen families and the role of chosen families. We lean more towards these institutional responses, like charities and others providing accommodation. All I've done is, because again, the evidence base is only just emerging, is to flag it. This idea of chosen families, that for some young people, the solution isn't another institutional setting or another charity-run setting. It can be chosen families. But again, as I say, there isn't really an evidence base to talk to on that. Then staying on upstream, unapologetically staying as early as we can. Another area where there's emerging practice, but the evidence base is, again, still embryonic, is the use of screening tools. And everyone's like, oh no, predictive analytics. And you should be saying that because there's all sorts of concerns around ethics that we need to engage with. But I'm just going to highlight three. I'll start at the bottom, just to mix it up. So the Veterans Health Administration, they basically have two questions. When veterans come in for health checks, they have two questions that basically find out, are you homeless now? Are you likely to be homeless in the next few months? They haven't evaluated it. They can't tell cause and effect. But they know in the US, when they've been asking these questions, they've seen a reduction in homelessness because there's then an intervention after that screening. You can imagine that playing out in any of our health settings, not just with veterans, but in other health settings. What if we just routinely asked these simple questions and then acted, of course? Second one, Maidstone Borough Council, OneView. They basically pool all the data they've got around rent arrears, other forms of debt, any issues that are flagging up in their this is council, municipal authority data sets. They merge them, they can identify people, and then they basically message them and say, look, can we help? They've seen a reduction. They report a massive reduction in the number of people then presenting to the homelessness system. Again, it's not been academically or rigorously evaluated, but it's showing really, really impressive promise. It's something we should be looking into. And then my favourite is this second one, the Geelong project from Australia, also called Upstream in Canada, Wales, England, Scotland, the US, and now Belgium. Yeah, and Denmark is coming too. So the Upstream project, no, I called it a project. I always swore I'd never call it a project. The Upstream approach intervention, because it can't be a project, it needs to be just a thing that we do routinely, is a screening tool in schools. And so we would basically survey you. If you were my class, I would survey you, so it's universal. We're not discriminating and just pulling you out for your intervention. We're just screening everybody, and we ask you about how home life is and a few other things. And some of those questions let me know that you are at risk of homelessness. They're really simple things and early indicators. And that then leads to an intervention. Here's a little bit, we've got time, so let's wake you up a bit. How would I know? You're my class. How would I know that you are homeless? How am I going to know? Because here's the thing. You try and sell this to we know who the homeless kids are. We know who they are in my class. How do we know? Hands up. How would I know that one of you was at risk? Oh, you're a cheat. Okay, yes, there's conflicts at parents. I can't see that in my class. How do I visually know that you are at risk? Or, yeah, behavior. Yeah, good. You cheated. You've jumped to my next slide. Right, behavior. How else? This side. How else might I know that somebody in this class is homeless? Yeah, you're tired. You're sleeping. Yeah. Absent. Give me one more. Hungry. Brilliant. And not performing. These are all the things that teachers say, we know who the kids are. Youth workers say, we know who they are. And you know, that is true. A lot of those things are true for about 50%. But for the other 50% in the class, school is the safe place. I keep coming, I keep doing just fine, and I'm just getting on. And you do not know about me. You do not know that I'm having conflict at home with my parents, and that last week I had to sleep away from home because things weren't going well in the house. And we asked that in the survey. And that enables you to have a conversation. And it's not dogmatically saying, you answered the survey in this way, therefore you get the intervention. The coordinator for this in Wales articulates it beautifully. And he says, the survey is the whisper before the conversation. That's his words, not mine. The whisper before the conversation. The survey lets you know there might be something, but then you sit down and you have a conversation and you just find out what's going on. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to get an intervention. But if there is conflict at home, then there's a mediation offer. So these things are emerging. The evidence base is just emerging. We need to do way more and far more robust evaluation. Evictions. I'm going to fly through this because this is probably a bit more familiar. Kenner et al. Did a review and they basically identify 3 kind of types of approach that we get around evictions. And one, legal requirements to notify authorities and act. We're in the right place to be talking about this. The two main examples are Austria and Belgium. One where there's a duty to notify. The other where there's a duty to notify and take action to do something about it. I cannot understand how that good practice has not travelled across the entirety of the world. Like, why do we not do that everywhere, routinely? And we did. I used to have a colleague that said, good practice travels slow. And this is one of those examples where it really does. Short-term financial assistance, that's kind of the everyday of kind of eviction prevention, isn't it? Let's pay off debt. Let's pay rent in advance or whatever. And then legal support, advice, representation. Again, that's the mainstream of organisations like Shelter, but we don't have evaluations. There's some evidence. This was US evidence. But we lack robust evaluations of these interventions. But they're out there. And then, of course, other forms of crisis prevention. We look at things like relationship breakdown and domestic abuse in particular. And here's another. There's quite a lot of innovation in the space around domestic abuse. And again, we know very little about what works for whom in what context. I have a wonderful PhD student who's just completed, who looked at this, experiences of domestic abuse and homelessness, and spoke with mostly women about their pathways and their journeys. And we were really interested in prevention, what works. And of course, there's a shift towards what we call in the UK target hardening. So where women would be unable to remain in the home and it becomes the perpetrator that would leave and you're able to remain. And that's kind of been embraced as this great thing to do, but actually with some of the women, they felt less at home in this environment than they did when they eventually then moved to a refuge because of what she described as complicit community. So other members of the community complicit in this abuse. So we just need to problematize some of these things, these interventions that we think are great, and actually just listen to the people who we're being offered to. But again, the message is there are innovations out there, but we don't have a great evidence base on what works. Then we've got crisis prevention. So remembering this is the kind of homelessness is foreseeable. The one that I like to flag is Wales, where this is one thing that I think we've done well, and those that went to the spotlight on Wales will know all about this from Ruth. But we have the Housing Wales Act 2014, or as the Canadians call it, Duty to Assist. Thanks, Steve. It's a way better name. In short, this duty is placed on all local authorities, and local authorities are required to take what we call reasonable steps. So if you turn up at the local authority and you're at risk of homelessness, that foreseeable period, the local authority has to try and prevent your homelessness. It's supposed to be centered on the individual needs. You're supposed to develop a plan. There's lots of suppose because it doesn't quite work as it's intended to, but it's made a radical shift in how we've responded to homelessness. Again, if you're interested, we can talk more about that after. We're nearly there. Oh my goodness, yeah. Prevention during crisis. So just like one slide, just to say, the main takeaway. Nicholas Pleece did a wee review on this. Was that those countries, those municipalities, those cities, who had systems, homelessness service responses and systems that were largely housing-led, where everybody was already getting accommodation, that were self-contained, they were way more resilient to the COVID pandemic than the other countries that were so reliant on this really poor quality emergency accommodation that proliferates in so many places. And the UK is the best example of that. It was a natural experiment. So Scotland, you had an entitlement to accommodation. England and Wales, it was temporary accommodation. In England in particular, lots of shared space accommodation. The leap that we had to take in England and Wales to get everybody accommodated, we were commissioning every sort of accommodation you could imagine, much like other member states. In Scotland, it was like, we need 3 or 4 extra rooms for people. Scotland was like, we need 3 or 4 extra rooms for people who otherwise didn't have recourse to public funds, because their system was far more housing-led. And I suspect the same would be true in Finland. Our response to Ukrainian refugees, I think what this showed is how reactive we're having to be. We didn't have a plan. We have no idea of the unintended consequences of some of our actions in our response. And I think we'll be seeing the implications of it for years to come. But again, it was just a quick pause. So the last slide before we go for questions was to reflect on, when you look across the evidence base of what evidence there is about what works in prevention, we can draw out 3 or 4 points about enablers and barriers. The first one is to come back to that first part of the typology. We could get really obsessed with cool innovations in universal and crisis prevention because they're things that we can do as a sector. Those are things we get, but actually we can't take our eyes off the universal prevention efforts. We can do all we like around these innovations, but if we don't have enough housing and folk don't have enough income, then we're not going to fix anything. So all of this, we still need effective universal prevention. Political will and resources, oh my goodness. If we want to make this shift away from a system that is based on temporary accommodation, hostels, where whole financial models are based on this system, people's jobs are based on this system, it takes a really big political will and associated finance, because for a while you're going to have to double fund. You're going to have to keep funding the emergency crisis response whilst you go heavy on prevention. It's going to be double until you see fewer people ending up in emergency situations. That takes political will. And Leilani Farha, previous UN rapporteur, says that, we need governments to show up. That was her phrase, and I think that's the point there. Systematic integration. So one of the barriers to real change is that we treat prevention as if it's like they are projects, which is why I was so annoyed that I used the word project. They're projects, they're little innovations, they're sporadic, they're working just with particular groups. It's very rare that we see it really systematically addressed. Now, I think some of the strategies that are emerging now that have prevention in, they're a good sign that we're maybe getting more systematic about our approach to prevention. And then the fourth point, collaboration and buy-in, is a crucial one. And I've said this to many a folk. The more we're doing around prevention, the more I'm doing around prevention, the more I spend my time talking to schools, health, criminal justice. They're the folk that I'm engaging with as much as I'm engaging with you guys, because that's where our efforts have to be. And sometimes we're like the weaker party, aren't we? Housing is always a weaker friend. The minister is kind of, in England, the minister, you get them for my socks last longer, right? They're in and they're out. It's not a portfolio anyone wants. So, this has been recorded. Hello, minister. That buy-in, often as housing, we don't have the power around the table. Health has the power and others. Right? But they're the people that we need around the table. We need them taking responsibility and seeing homelessness prevention as their job. And then the last one is an important one, is about equal or equitable access. If we do all of this and just make it available, and we think it's universally available to everyone, we'll probably fail. Because generally we fail marginalised, racialised, LGBTQI plus groups if that's all we do. So we have to have our eye on that too and have to deliberately design these systems and services. That's it. The conclusion just repeats that. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for two very stimulating presentations. I immediately open the floor for questions. I suggest we take 2-3 questions so that maybe certain elements can be answered together. So the floor is open. Here.
Hi, thanks for 2 excellent presentations as always. I think I'm conscious of the fact that a lot of the progress we make and a lot of progress we've seen in Ireland always happens 6 months too late, because they tends to be driven by crisis. And what I think Eoin's central point is that without the housing, all the other bits really struggle to succeed. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't at least put that infrastructure in place. I think it's a really important question. But how do we maintain momentum when it's so hard to get the housing in place? Or is it a call to say, well, actually we need to prioritize housing for people experiencing or at risk of homelessness to the, not the detriment, but to the prioritize over and above anything else if we're going to get ahead of this crisis, and that'll help us to build the momentum. So I think it's kind of a general sort of, what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you. May I ask maybe to introduce yourself? We heard that this is from Ireland, but maybe if you want to say...
Wayne Stanley from the Simon Communities of Ireland.
If there's no more question for the moment, if you want to...
Take it. Don't pass it to me. That was a question for you. Go for it. Go on, have a shot.
I suppose it's a two-pointer question. How do you maintain... Well, I take the second one first. And this has come up quite a bit in Ireland. Do you, one easy way to reduce the numbers of people in emergency accommodation, you prioritise them for access for social housing. I'm kind of reluctant to advocate for that because I think it goes back to the central point. In the absence of an adequate supply, we end up in a distribution war between who is deserving, who's undeserving, and who should get what. So I'm very reluctant to do that because we've seen it in recent months in Ireland with new people coming into the country about, again, who's entitled to accommodation. So I think if you get into that system, and I think most countries have a system of prioritisation for access to social housing tenancies, and I think usually built into those allocation systems are weightings for those who are in emergency accommodation rather than creating a parallel system. So there is a temptation to say, yeah, look, for the next 6 to 9 months, all new social housing allocations go to those in emergency accommodation. I'm less concerned about what economists are really nervous about something like that is that does it create a distorting effect that people will enter homelessness in order to rapidly. The only piece of evidence I'm aware is a piece of work that Brendan or Dan O'Flaherty did in New York. And he argued that that wasn't the case when they did provide more and more accommodation for families, I think, particularly. And they provided housing vouchers to get them out. So he said, yes, there was an increase in families who came into emergency accommodation, probably driven by the lure of the vouchers, but the vouchers got far more people out than brought in. I think the ratio, he got 7 families out for every one it brought in. I think it was his calculation at the end. So he said, yes, there is a trade-off, but it's probably worth it in that case. But I'd be less concerned about that argument rather than, I just think across Europe at the moment, things are so politically fraught around distribution issues about who gets what, and particularly with migration. I just think it's I'd be kind of very wary about going down that road at the moment.
Yeah, I think one of the big, wouldn't it be good if we could actually just understand what proportions of allocations went to homeless households? If we just talk about allocations to homeless households, even within the UK, there's massive variation. I mean, massive variation, and the data's not great. In Wales is the worst data on this. We can't really work it out. But from what we've got, it looks like we allocate 15 to 20% less of our stock to people experiencing homelessness. And it just takes one authority to go, I'll tell you what, for a period of time, we're going to match the rate that they do in Scotland. And you can make a massive impact on the challenge that we've all been hearing around people in temporary accommodation or in really insecure accommodation. So I think it's definitely a tool that we need to be looking at, allocations personally. The other point to make in this is, oh my goodness, it's hard. We're both lucky we're academics. We don't actually have to do the doing. We can just say, here's a good idea. But here's the thing. If the duty isn't on government to do this, to find the housing, to source the housing through whatever it is, where does that responsibility lie? It lies with the individual. They can't build housing. They're not going to get it. So my view is, unless that duty lies on government, and it is awkward, you won't get the housing built. So again, it's horrid, and I can't imagine the frustrations. And the frustrations are felt by the frontline staff and the managers of those services, potentially not by the elected officials who are saying no to more housing. But for me, it has to be onto the state, personally.
Other questions? One more here. A reflection. Is that a question there? No.
Yeah, more of a reflection than the question, but yeah, as I was listening to your presentations, I think that was exactly the point that I was going back to, is where does it fit with, we're involved in a campaign for right to adequate housing in Wales, where does it fit with that? Because actually we just every conversation keeps coming back to supply, really. And the other challenge that you touched on, Pete, was just how pressurised the system is, and I don't know how the extent to which this reads across to other countries, but when you're dealing with kind of public sector services and third sector services, which commonly describe themselves as on their knees, then actually achieving transformation is really problematic, and the political will to take risks and take radical decisions is not there. So again, I'm just interested in any reflections that you might have on that.
You saw we need government to show up. It's one of our main barriers. That I just agree with you. If governments don't show up, we can't do this, I don't think. Although maybe there's somebody out there in the private sector, some benevolent, who knows? But I think this is a government responsibility. If you're going to pursue a market, markets are not designed to meet the needs of the poorest and the most vulnerable. They're not. That's what government's job is to do, is to step in if you're going to pursue a market economy, which we all do. Yeah.
No, I think that was a central point in my paper, that without an adequate supply of so secure and affordable housing, we will end up in the kind of situation that Wayne had alluded to. Like, do we end up in those kind of fights about who gets what? Because you're fighting for a scarce resource and you create all sorts of difficulties. I suppose one thing I have been reflecting on, because there's almost certainly in Ireland, and I think a couple of other countries, and particularly in the UK, a consensus that we need to go back building lots of social housing. And I was reflecting on some historical work I was doing, but that I'm trying to think of the English author who wrote the book, but just a line jumped out at me. He said, what brought about the demise of social housing in England was the allocation system that gave homeless people access, and that brought it about because they brought stigmatisation. And the same thing happened in Ireland. We had, for the first time in the late 80s, we had a surplus stock, and people who traditionally wouldn't have got social housing got social housing for the first time. Now, it was about estate management, but it created stigmatisation of social housing that almost people have forgotten about at this stage, who are now calling for mass social housing. 30 years ago, they're calling, saying, this is the worst thing that we ever did. So there's kind of very short memories on some of these projects or some of these debates.
It's also how they built. So it was estates. Yeah. It was everyone in the same place, whereas the model is now, well, it's mostly different. Yeah.
Any more questions? I just want to, while you think about the extra question, a comment. I mean, what we see also in our mutual learning program with member states is that definitely a supply of affordable quality housing is a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient one. The problem is that we see more. I mean, we see two problems. That the homelessness agenda has been hijacked a bit about sort of housing, because housing is more sort of middle class. It attracts more political consensus, and so you know, a very strong focus on building housing supply, which is important, needs to be there. But then there is the question of allocation, so how this is allocated, and then how you kind of reach out and you support people in transition. Even within a housing first model, you really need to have an accompanying. And on the governance side, we've been, I mean, you and you know, the homelessness world, I don't know how to put it, has been so effective that in certain member states, homelessness policies have passed to housing departments. And so now they have to meet, you know, these ambitious targets of ending homelessness, however you define it. This is the case, for example, in Germany. But they don't have, is what I was referring to before, the policy levers, because the social ministry is not there, the home office is not there in relation to, for example, asylum seeker refugees. So, you know, I think, you know, as you said, sort of housing first, housing supply, housing led. I think there is a broad consensus. We shouldn't, this is my view, go too far in that direction, and also think about, you know, the other support policies. But then, of course, yeah, we need houses. Any question there?
You heard him.
Great, thanks for great presentations. Tim Obrey, University of Ottawa. Actually, that's quite a lineup, of prevention possibilities. So I actually had two questions. They're kind of related. One is around the allocation issue, because we're not going to get all of those prevention interventions funded right away. Which would you prioritize? And then the second one is just around the research part. You pointed out that, you know, the research base it's quite variable when it comes to these prevention interventions. So which ones would you prioritize to do research on?
Since we are approaching the end, if there is one more question, I would suggest we take it now. Then we go with this question. And
do you want to take one of them and I'll take the other one?
I think both for you.
No, come on, let's share it out. We're democratic. Tim, that's a great question. You're just trying to give me your next funding bid. Which one do you want to take? Which intervention you prioritise? You can take the research one. Go on.
No, you go first.
Okay, so intervention, that seems fair. You did it last time. So intervention, I'm already prioritising the upstream intervention. It's the youth homelessness one. Yeah, go team. I'm doing that for free and have been for like 2 years. So that's the one I'd prioritise. It's the one that just, in Australia, it led to the evaluation is a little bit opaque, and that's what I mean about quality of. But it showed a 40% reduction in the number of young people presenting at homelessness services. If you can get anywhere near that, think that the number, again, Talog, the coordinator for the intervention in Wales, talks about it. He's like, imagine, because you're acting, his job was a mediator at 16, 17 when they were at crisis and appearing at our homelessness services and they'd been kicked out. He's like, I'm now doing the same job, but 3 or 4 years earlier with these youngsters, and I'm removing this from the journey. Like, how powerful is that? So that's the one that I am prioritising but would love the help, Tim. You can do the evaluation one.
Tim, I'm afraid I switched off and I heard him saying prevention, so I didn't listen to the second part of your
evaluation.
question.
What would you evaluate? What would you evaluate?
Around prevention?
Yeah.
I think I would focus on some of those things around emergency prevention, how those who do enter and how you prevent those at that kind of just at that last stage getting in, because we know a bit more about those that are closer to the system, but we still don't know what the trigger is for a cohort of people that are all in objectively a similar situation. They have a notice of termination, etc. Because we know, I'm fairly familiar with the Irish data, we know the majority don't tip into emergency accommodation. So what is it about? Is it some personal characteristics? Is it that issue I raised about social or human capital or financial support? Or what is it that stops some people from making that final stage into emergency accommodation, because we know there's a much larger population who are at the cusp of entering emergency accommodation, but the majority don't. We just don't know enough about what's going on there at that very final stage. So something along there, I think, would be very helpful.
The CTI seems to me to be just waiting to be evaluated, eh? That critical time intervention for people coming out of prison. Like, it seems to me that's very doable. You know, coming out of hospital, quite frankly, even coming out of care, you know, that's because it's a model, you know, and it's very systematic, it's very specific,
Yeah.
you know. Yeah.
We are almost at the end, 6:30. If there is one last burning question, I think we can still take it. Otherwise, I would like to thank you all. First of all, thank Eoin and Pete for, again, excellent presentation. You will also find their papers on the website of the European Platform on Combating Homelessness. And thanks for the last intervention. Keep your eyes open for the Social Innovation Call, and we'll be there waiting for your suggestions, your applications, your ideas to really put in place sound evaluation, sound innovation in the field of homelessness. Thank you very much, and safe journey home, and have a nice evening.